In this video lecture, we're going to continue talking about the progress of causing disease. A little bit more here with some additional terminology. So there is a table in your textbook that gives you some definitions of different infection types. And so, be sure you go through these terms and know these definitions. I'll kind of briefly go through them here. Localized infection versus a systemic infection, kind of what it sounds like. A localized infection is occurring in a local area of the body, like maybe a sore on the skin, or maybe you have an infection of the pancreas. Systemic is where the microbes are spreading throughout the body and are impacting multiple body areas. That's a systemic infection. Focal infection is where you have microbes in some local area of the body, but it's kind of a seeding ground for microbes to leave that area and spread to other parts of the body. So kind of the main original area of infection is the focal infection site. Mixed infection or polymicrobial infection. This is an area of research as we're beginning to understand that sometimes infections can be caused by more than one microbe at the same time. Primary versus secondary infection, be sure you understand those definitions. Sometimes secondary infections will follow a primary infection, like perhaps you've had a viral infection of the sinuses, and then that leads to a bacterial infection later. So that bacterial infection would be a secondary infection. Or in AIDS patients, HIV is a primary infection. HIV cripples the immune system, and then you develop all kinds of horrible secondary infections if your HIV is not being treated. Acute infection versus chronic. So you hear acute and chronic used quite a bit in classes that are health sciences oriented. An acute infection is pretty much what we typically talk about. You get infected with an organism, you get sick, and then you get over it. A chronic infection is one where the symptoms may not be as severe, but they're longer lasting. So it takes a long time to get over the infection. The infection persists for a long period of time. Some additional terminology here, the stages of infectious disease. And so this is a graph that is showing you graphically the different phases that a typical infectious disease will go through. So our y-axis over here, you'll notice it's labeled as number of microorganisms and intensity of signs or symptoms. Okay, so the greater the population of the microorganisms in general, the sicker you're going to feel. And this is timeline over here, so they don't have any actual days or anything on the timeline because these phases are going to differ in lengths according to the particular infectious disease that you have. So the first stage of an infectious disease is the incubation period, and time zero over here is where you first get exposed. The microbes first enter the body. So there's a period of time where those microbes have entered, they've attached, they're evading your immune system, they are beginning to multiply, but you don't really have any symptoms of the illness. You don't know that you're sick. Then you enter a phase where you perceive that you're starting to get sick. You might have kind of vague symptoms. That's called the prodromal period. Pro means before, and dromal here is referring to disease. So it's actually before you hit the full-blown disease stage. Then you hit the part of the illness where you feel horrible. This is where your symptoms are the worst. And your textbook calls this the period of invasion. And other sources will call this the illness period. But that's where you feel the most sick. Then your immune system kicks in, or maybe you've taken some antimicrobial drugs to help you fight the infection as well. So the numbers of microbes are declining, and you're starting to feel better. That's called the decline phase. And then finally you reach the convalescence phase. So this is where, how if you get really sick, there's a period of time where you're no longer sick, you don't really have any symptoms, but you still feel run down and tired because your body has to repair all that damage that took place, and that's called the convalescence stage of infectious disease. So be sure you're familiar with this terminology. And again, these stages can differ for different pathogens, different types of infectious disease. And this is a table from a previous textbook, which I thought was pretty interesting, comparing just the incubation period, that time from when the microbes first enter the body to the point where you first begin to start feeling some symptoms. And that can be as short as maybe about a day with influenza, or it can be years if you are infected with HIV and develop AIDS or something like leprosy. We don't really have leprosy cases in the United States anymore unless somebody comes in from another country where they contracted it. But that's a bacterial disease caused by a relative of Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It's called Mycobacterium leprae. And you get exposed to that, and it can be decades before you actually have any real symptoms of skin flaking off and so forth associated with leprosy. I know on this table they've got the Staphylococcus foodborne infection. That's that Staphylococcus food poisoning we were talking about. And to me, that's not really a true infection because it's the toxin that the exotoxin those bacteria produce that makes you sick. And so, there's not really a true incubation period, but there is a delay from the time that you first swallow those toxins in the food to the point where you start vomiting and having diarrhea. So that's why they're saying that incubation period there is less than 1 day. So how about this terminology, signs and symptoms? So what's the difference between those two types of things? So in a nutshell, a symptom is something that a patient perceives, like pain, I'm tired, run down, or lethargic. A sign is something that can be measured clinically. So you can observe the patient and see it, or you can run a test and detect something. So that's the difference between signs and symptoms. Now, we've already talked a little bit about inflammation and how that gets triggered anytime you have a infectious disease. So what are some signs that are associated with inflammation? Abscesses. So that's where you have a pus-filled wound either on the outside or the inside of the body. And when you have an abscess it's got pus in it, that's generally a sign of a bacterial infection. That's going to be a sign because you can actually see the abscess. Granulomas are masses of immune system cells produced by a group of white blood cells known as the granulocytes, and we'll talk about those when we get into chapter 12. Those develop in kind of an attempt to wall off an infection in the body. So if you observe something like that, that's a sign because you can see it. Lymphadenitis is another term for swollen lymph nodes. So that's a sign of infection. We've all had our cervical lymph nodes up in here pressed by a physician when we came in with a sore throat. The blood will display measurable signs of infection. They'll run blood work at times to see what's going on. So some terminology, here you should be familiar with. Leukocytosis is an increase in leukocytes. Leukocytes are white blood cells. Leukopenia means a decrease in white blood cells. So some infectious diseases are associated with an increase, and some are associated with a decrease in your white blood cells. And that can provide information to a physician about what you're infected with. Septicemia is an actual infection of the blood. So you've got microorganisms that are actually multiplying in your blood and feeding off of the materials in the blood. Bacteremia or viremia can merely refer to the presence of bacteria or viruses in the bloodstream. And they're not necessarily multiplying there. They may just be traveling through the blood from one location to another. But again, anytime you see that emia, that refers to something in the blood. Septicemia would be the worst thing here. You have an actual microbial population explosion going on in your bloodstream. Don't forget we talked about toxemia too. That's where you have a bacterial toxin present in the bloodstream. All right, so that'll conclude that video clip. Not quite as long as some of the others. The next one, we're finally to step 5 in our story about the progress of infection. And we're going to talk about the portals of exit that exist in the body. And then that's going to lead us into talking about transmission. How do microbes get transmitted from one host to another?